And despite the commitments by competent authorities, we do pay extra attention to ensuring the safety and security of our foreign missions. We look carefully at the situation on the ground. We base our measures and responses on the new realities. Given the situation on the ground, we may or may not introduce additional measures to beef up physical or structural security of Russian diplomatic agencies. Question. And a second question, if I may, about the possible negotiations on Ukraine. Is it already known, any information on the level of representation from Foreign Ministry? Answer. It's not the proper time to discuss this. I think there are more important matters. On behalf of the Foreign Ministry, I can tell you this. We will act swiftly and be quick in forming such a delegation. But I think it would be more appropriate at this juncture to focus on other things. Responsible behavior of Ukraine is what matters at the moment. As I was preparing for this briefing, I've taken stock of Foreign Minister Kuleba's statement, wherein he stated the following, that Kiev is going to address The Hague with regard to the Russia's special operation. Well, let me underscore this. Whoever is responsible for Ukraine's conduct at the moment should exercise their duties responsibly. If they believe themselves to be still a part of the executive branch of power of Ukraine, they should somehow coordinate and consolidate their efforts. So what is the question, what is the request made by President Zelensky, and what is he wishes to accomplish by his requests? I believe that his team should refrain from sending mixed signals from such statements. Well, I mean, it's appropriate and proper for any kind of a situation, but in this particular context, this is crucial.
Especially in the situation which we see today. So do we have here newsroom information portal? Yes, Madam Zakharova, good afternoon. And I have two questions today. Finland has voiced its readiness to apply to join NATO if it comes to its national security, and how does Moscow evaluate such statements, and can be accession of other countries neighboring with Russia to the alliance foster escalation. And our position on this has been voiced by our Foreign Minister Lavrov, including during the press conference this year in January. He mentioned it then. And if there is a need, I can remind you about the main aspects of this. We see this line of Finnish government and their policy of military non-alliance as an important factor in ensuring security and stability in Northern Europe. And at the same time, we cannot help but note the targeted efforts of NATO and other members of this alliance to involve Finland as well as Sweden in this alliance. And this is nothing new. The intensity of practical interaction between Helsinki and Stockholm with NATO, and Minister Lavrov mentioned it in the mid-January this year, and this topic has been regularly commented on before. And they have conducted NATO's military exercises, and these countries have provided territory for such maneuvers of this military alliance, and it's close to Russia's borders, and this includes Americans' imitation of attacks of using nuclear weapons against the so-called comparable enemy, and it's easy to understand who it's supposed to be. And We have seen this policy over a number of years, and the aspect of OSCE's national members and providing security is the national sovereignty, and Finland and Sweden should not base their security in based on damaging security of other countries, and their accession to NATO can have detrimental consequences and face some military and political consequences. And second question, head of Donbass declared that made a declaration, and is it possible to that the borders of those republics will be moved? And today I can say that countries Donetsk and Lugansk Republic have their own national policy in this regard. They have their own national legislation. They have their own laws, and they have emerging national policy. This has been mentioned during the meeting of Russia's foreign minister with his colleagues from Donetsk and Luhansk, and I can, in all honesty, advise you to directly contact them on their plans, because they have their own press services, and they have people which spearhead their information policy, and they're active on social media. So if in the past I would have said something, but now we are talking about sovereign states. So I would very much be grateful if you would contact them directly, and here we would talk about our own plans. Thank you very much. And moving on, do we have Sky News with us?
My question. Britain's Defence Secretary has said that Vladimir Putin has gone full tonto, that is English slang for completely mad. Certainly that's the view of many people looking at this. He's launched an unprovoked attack on his southern neighbour that is killing a lot of Ukrainian cousins of Russia and Russian soldiers. What's your reaction to that description of his action?
Well, you know, it's surprising that such evaluations are given by Defense Minister of the UK regarding authorities of a different state. I think he could have thought up of similar adjectives, thinking of British Prime Minister, if we talk about personal judgment. And if we talk about the operation and that there are people dying, then yes, unfortunately, this is a huge tragedy that there is a need to resort to such methods. And this is exactly what was talked about during 8 years of our policy, of our efforts, our work 24/7. That's what it took to demonstrate that the peaceful resolution of this high-tension conflict, which in 2015 was already a bloodbath and priority problem, that any other scenario other than dialogue is tragic in its nature and should be avoided. And could you please say how many years must it have taken, must have this bloodshed gone on in eastern Ukraine? 5, 10 years? Why did you start counting victims only today, or say yesterday? Who gave you the right to ignore victims, especially that we were talking about thousands of them over all these years? Isn't your conscience tormenting you? when you Western journalists speculating on Minsk agreements and Russia never mentioned that in the Eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk republics, there are peaceful citizens losing lives every day. You never counted them, just like President Zelensky never considered them people. Who gave you the right to speak of the victims starting only today? If that's the way you create your reports, if that's your approach to it, you are not journalists and you're not people. 13,000 people, and I am not dividing them, although in all honesty I would very much like to, and maybe should have, in those who shot first, in those who were members of Ukrainian military men or their regular army and nationalist battalions, which then became part of the armed forces. I do not divide them from civilians and from the people which you call militias, separatists, and which we say are self-defending. In all, according to OSCE, 13,000 people died, and OSCE had no opportunity to account for every victim. It's only their primary analysis. Where were you? Why didn't you ask these questions in Kiev? Why didn't you broadcast people in Donbass? Why did you give them no opportunity to attend international organizations meetings or join in online? You have no conscience at all. Maybe you should first calculate the number of the people which died at the hands of the British authorities in Iraq. How many people died there on the orders of Downing Street? How many civilians died and how many British military men died? Would you like to talk about Afghanistan? Because it's well time for that. So before you judge others, start with yourself. And if you talk about the situation in Ukraine and the actions of Russia in protecting peaceful citizens of Donbass, you shouldn't start counting with February 2022. This history is many years old. At least you should start with 2013. And the last thing I would like to say, you'd like to count the citizens which died. Did you count the people that died on Maidan in 2013, 2014? How many people died? How many people were killed by snipers? How many armed law enforcement people died? How many people were killed with stones? Have you ever reported on that? At least once during those years. So it's not for you to say that there's an operation conducted. It's not a beginning of a war. It's an operation to end a war which has been going on for many years, and ignoring it and not recognizing it is just as criminal as servicing informationally Kievan regime. And I am sorry for my emotion, but this has been overdue, and we do not want to listen to and trust your mass media. We will respond to your questions, but such starting points and such approaches are unacceptable, because what you do is propaganda, and it was fine with propaganda in other spheres, but when you tie it to promotion of war, which for 2 months you have been escalating, this is just inadmissible, and then you twist it all and blame the victims. I am sorry.
Is there any of that, please, Ms. Zakharova?
No. No. I do not want to.
Can I ask you, talk about Minsk? You're saying that you were prepared to go and talk with the Ukrainian regime in Minsk, but the terms for those talks seem to be the total surrender of Ukraine. You're saying it needs to be following demilitarization. How can that be acceptable to President Zelensky if you're asking him to surrender before he even begins negotiating with you?
Нет, минуточку. Вы сказали...
Wait, you said that. You heard me. Russia was ready to send an interagency delegation to negotiations in Minsk. We have declared that. We just mentioned it. We are ready for it, and it was said by the press secretary of our president, and from MFA I can also say that it is true. Such work can start any time. The only question is that whether the other side, under the influence of the West, wouldn't start to trying to weasel out or lie, or you yourselves, the representatives of the Kievan regime, would start contradicting and debunking each other. I just mentioned the declaration by Kuleba. This is not something I made up. This was reported by various news agencies. They have to determine their position. Are we talking about negotiations, or are we pressing such accusations against our country?
Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, has said that these talks can go ahead once Ukraine has demilitarized. Surely that's just demanding their complete surrender before talks have even begun.
No. We have mentioned that we are already ready, and obviously the objectives which have been put forward by the president before the implementation of the corresponding special operation, of course, they have not been cancelled by anyone. Yes, they are relevant still, but the issue is that we have reacted to corresponding requests on the part of President Zelensky. We saw his video and gave a reaction which corresponded.
This is the end of the war, when it could be the beginning of the biggest military offensive we've seen in Europe since World War II.
Что? Не очень поняла ваш вопрос.
Could you repeat, please, reframe your question?
Thank you. You've described this as the end of the war, but it could be the beginning of the biggest military campaign we've seen in Europe since World War II.
Answer. Well, no, I'm not going to fantasize this. This has nothing to do with the situation at hand. We are pursuing a stage-by-stage approach. The operation is ongoing. It has stated objectives. Ministry of Defense is making its comments. And we just recently seen the statement by Vladimir Zelensky. We have responded to it. Well, we're not going to fantasize again. There was a request, we responded to a request. End of story. Okay, and we are marching forward. Do we have other outlets online? I think we have the Serbian media online. Tanjuk, are you here?
Serbia.
Здравствуйте.
Thank you for your opportunity. Several times before the military intervention in Ukraine, President Putin emphasized the bombing of Yugoslavia as an example of the gravest violation of international law. Many analysts now say Putin's argument and military strategy are the same as those used by NATO during the attack on Yugoslavia. What is your response on these crimes?
First. Such comparisons are inept and invalid, and we do know how the West loves to fake and forge facts. We've been here before. Second. Oh, and by the way, Minister Lavrov mentioned this today at the press conference. But let me reiterate this to you. As far as I gather, you are from Serbia, and I will refresh your memory regardless. Remember, the NATO bombed Yugoslavia. I will not go on a tangent right now. I'm just, you asked to provide the rationale and what's the difference. I'll give you a difference. So NATO bombed Yugoslavia. They hit all kinds of targets: civilians, civilian infrastructure, military infrastructure, military personnel, anything, carpet bombing. As you might remember, they bombed Chinese embassy. They said it was a mistake, but still, it happened. You know better than me how many civilians died during the conflict because they were in the wrong place in the wrong time. They were hit by missile strikes or bombs. So what was the goal? Not to topple the government, but to destroy the country. This was a military operation aimed against civilians. I will not go into the subject of enriched uranium bullets. It's a whole different kind of story. You said that what's going on right now is an aggression. Well, let me tell you this. This is a special military operation that aims to defend nations that asked us for help. This is not the first time. They asked us in 2020 and 2021. They didn't first ask us to help in 2022. They started asking for help since 2014, when the Kievan regime trying to crack down on dissent on the east of Ukraine, and the regime sent troops to kill people in the east. They intended to use tanks and all kinds of weapons against citizens of their own country that was loyal to the legitimate government. They were true to their values, culture, and identity. They did not want to obey to the unconstitutional authorities when it was violently shoveled to them. That was the aggression on behalf of the Ukrainian regime. So that was the first time when they asked us for help. Well, do you remember that they actually held a referendum, both in Donetsk and Luhansk? And according to the data, the outcomes of the referendum, it was the unanimous vote. It was a unanimous vote. Well, you can dig into the archives and you will see this. We send them humanitarian relief. We send them medication. We help them with the infrastructure. Otherwise, people would just freeze to death during harsh winters. We send targeted help for children. We did land political support too. We helped to draft the first Minsk agreements, and then we participated in the drafting effort of the second Minsk agreements. And for 8 long years, we've tried to bring the Kievan regime to compliance. And we've tried to nudge them to engage in a direct dialogue with Donetsk and Luhansk. Well, our requests fell on deaf ears. It was a violent and bloody conflict for 8 years. So there were people responsible for this. We tried to draw the attention of those parties to the need to stop the bloodshed. But then all the opportunities to engage in a dialogue were vanquished. I've spoke at length about it yesterday and today too. We received a letter from Secretary Blinken, a message that they no longer want to engage in negotiations when Berlin and Paris failed in their efforts. They failed everyone as intermediaries, while the number of shots fired and shellings continued to increase, and the refugees flows just streamed out of the country, and the weapons were pumped into the country. Well, it left us no choice but to start a targeted, a pinpoint special operation. But you don't have to listen to me. You can listen to the hourly briefings of the Ministry of Defense. It's the targeted strikes on the military infrastructure. Ministry of Defense publicly stated the objectives of the special operation. They state the objective of each strike. And one crucial thing that bears mentioning: starting in June of 2021, we regularly drew attention to the provocation and subversions conducted by the NATO countries and with participation of Ukraine in direct proximity of our country. First, I am referring to raids in the Black Sea waters, when British destroyer ended Russia's territorial waters, and it only stopped after a warning shot of our Navy. For days on end, NATO exercises in the direct vicinity of our borders were conducted. What was the purpose of that? Is that what you call a Pacific policy? But it didn't stop at that. The provocations moved to the airspace up above the Black Sea waters, when military aircraft of NATO flew dangerously close to Russia's civilian aircraft. And not just Russian civilian aircraft. And all of these things happened above our national territory and above the Black Sea. Well, imagine yourself, you're in a jet, you're in an aircraft flying somewhere, and 50 meters away from you there is a NATO warplane maneuvering dangerously close to your aircraft, and there is nothing you can do to stop this. This is a military plane. It's quick, it's nimble, it can do whatever it wants to do. From October to November of 2021, we registered 5 or 6 such incidents. Well, let's go back a couple of years back, when there was a vessel replete with weapons trying to ram its way through the Kerch Strait and into the Russian territory. Well, I've told this before. For 8 years, the bloody conflict was going on. Ukraine was trying to provoke us by all means necessary. It used NATO's equipment and arms. And then Ukraine itself received all kinds of weapons, all kinds of offensive weapons. And I don't quite remember anyone in Yugoslavia saying something like this. In the Minsk conference on security policy, it was not an arms trade show. It was the nuclear scientists conference on the security policy. Well, Ukrainians stated that they will look into the possibility of making nuclear weapons. They leave this option on the table. What do you think about this kind of prospect? Well, we're not exactly happy about it. This confluence of events is not a random thing. It's not a coincidence. And our president mentioned this in his statement, referring to Munich plot and the appeasement policy. Well, we were not going to engage in the appeasement policy. We all know how it ends. Do we have any other questions? Do we have Banks and Finance Information Agency here? If they're absent, do we have colleagues from Armenia? Verelk Information Agency. Yes, Armenia here. I have 3 questions. President Aliyev signed a memorandum with President Putin on the political cooperation between Russia and Azerbaijan. First, how this agreement will affect Russia's stance on Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia being a co-chair. It was mentioned that it's necessary to determine the Karabakh status, given the nation's right for self-determination. Answer. As far as Nagorno-Karabakh is concerned and the restoring Armenian-Azerbaijani relations, the declaration on the allied interaction with Azerbaijan, its paragraph 9, spells out that the parties will provide all the necessary assistance to implement the arrangements made by the leaders of the 3 countries in November 9, 2020. The paragraph 10 says that the parties will interact in accomplishing the objectives that stem from these arrangements and cooperate closely on establishing lasting peace in the region. That being said, this declaration enhances the regional security, and the stance of the co-chairs of the OSCE Russia group, the United States and France, was spelled out in their joint statements. The last of them dates back to December 7. The second question. Okay, question. How this agreement will affect Russia's commitments before Armenia in the OSCE and the bilateral agreements? Answer. We believe that this document in no way detracts from Russia's interaction with Armenia. We will strictly comply with all our bilateral commitments to Yerevan, our close and old ally, and we believe that the declaration signed with Baku will actually help enhancing trilateral interaction between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia, including on matters of security, economics, and humanitarian cooperation in Transcaucasia. Moreover, we continuously update our bilateral legal framework with Armenia, which currently comprises of some 200 documents. Question. Thank you. And the last question. Well, this agreement has plenty of paragraphs on military political cooperation between Moscow and Baku. So how will this affect the military political union between Baku and Ankara, given the already ratified Shushin declaration and Moscow's request for NATO to cease and desist from military cooperation with post-Soviet countries? Answer. Can you reframe the question? It was a bit of an alphabet soup. Question. How will this affect the military political track? Answer. Well, I got this. I just don't understand what does this has to do with the military efforts. Question. Well, because it asks, because Moscow demands from NATO to refrain from military cooperation with post-Soviet states. Answer. All right, I got it. The declaration on this interaction with Azerbaijan is not aimed against any other countries. And quite conversely, it enhances regional security. It's one of its core provisions. Military and political ties is something we discuss both with Baku and Ankara, and they know Russian stance on this regard. That being said, we have mutually beneficial cooperation formats, such as the 3+3 advisory regional platform, and we cooperate with Iran, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and we even leave the door open for Georgia. That, I think, covers it all. Well, you see, I think it appears to me that the question was framed in a bit of a incorrect way. We're not talking about the NATO's commitment, the demand for NATO not to expand its infrastructure. That's something tangential to the issue. The idea is the indivisible security, that you would not detract from the security of others in order to ensure yours. Once this core value is complied with, we don't mind if there's any kind of military cooperation between any other countries, if it's not aimed against any third country. So if we phrase the question this way, I'll be able to answer it. But either this, or please give me a direct quote from the document. You see the cooperation between our countries, a cooperation between any other two countries, whether they belong to some blocs or not, is developed in a sovereign way. And yet there are certain principles. For instance, if we're talking about military cooperation, it should not be waged in order to detract from security of any other country. If you factor this equation, the equation of indivisible security in, we're fine with it. We don't mind. It works for this area, it works for military and political affairs and many others.
You see, every time we understand that you have your own priorities, and now the topic of Ukraine, we always get the questions regarding that they have as a regime, as Kiev, as state authorities to conduct military and trade cooperation, and all military provisions are legitimate, etc., etc. Yes, that's true, but there are certain nuances, because once after 2015, 2016, we saw military provisions to the country. We thought it was strange that international efforts should be directed, focused, concentrated on implementing Minsk agreements, but instead somehow they were shifting towards military provisions of armaments, although Minsk agreements provided for different things. And when it started to be accompanied with provocations, we started asking even more questions regarding such provisions, and we see constant provocations near the border, especially our border. And of course we ask questions, and we don't just ask questions, we protest, and it's hard not to notice. And it was all in this that way tied to NATO as an alliance. And moving on, they continued with mass murder of people, civilians, and aggressive rhetoric against us. All together with this sanctions policy, all of this just tied it all into one scary knot. And you also have to see the real situation. And it's normal to give historic examples, but they still have to be projectable to a given situation. And we should proceed from specific, concrete facts. It's like ABCs. So moving on, if you have no further questions, do we have here our compatriots publication called Mesti? Yes, Madam Zakharova. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to congratulate you to making it to the list of the best people of Russia, the sanctions list. And I have two questions. First, these days, many of my personal private acquaintances from various countries, my compatriots, are being contacted by compatriots not only in support of Russia's policy regarding Donbass and problems of security. They also ask to transmit and send off letters addressed to highest authorities of Russia, as well as Ministry of Foreign Affairs and you personally. For example, Pan Gudlichka and Pani Ludmila Fritsova and Pan Anton Dusha and Piotr Michal, who's in Donetsk right now, and many others. Do you have any address where such letters could be sent to? Of course, you know it. You could send it to us. If we talk about a wish to send it to countries' authorities, you can refer to Kremlin.ru websites. And of course, we all suffer from DDoS attacks, Kremlin side and MFA's side website, and this is just going to get worse. But you can send it via email, and if you quote a specific person to be sent to, we can redirect it. And for example, we know that Czechia is cut off from Russia, and all the Russian language is cut off, and they cannot even listen to your speeches. What do you mean? All the Russian language sources, all the Russian language websites and etc. But our website, can you open it? Can you access? No, we cannot. And my friends from there say that when I send them a link to your briefing on the Foreign Ministry's website, they cannot access it. Is this some kind of official decision? Yes, by the Ministry of the Interior, starting today. Okay, fine. And my second question. See, along all lines, in all spheres, this is something hard to analyze, hard to process. How can this be possible? We live in 21st century. They shut down TV channels, but not overnight, but methodically, year after year, and do it more and more unashamedly. They block our presence in social media, in video hosting, and they banish journalists, and they declare blockades against the entire information flow, Russian language information flow with different opinions and points of view. And you mentioned me, yes, maybe in regard with the same thing, that I communicate to journalists and communicate the point of view our country holds. But what you just told me, this is news to me, and we will definitely study this. I did not know about it. Maybe this is the last-minute decision, just latest decision, which I haven't known about till now, that all Russian language sources can be blocked officially. Yes, this is today's decision. I will send you information after the briefing. But what did we expect, on the other hand? A year ago, they just went off and blocked the US president's account for nothing, an acting president. And it was done by the same people. Well, it was welcomed by the same people and initiated based on the same logic, using which they demanded that he, the US president, would not block their comments and would not delete even the most offensive of the comments, and in this way would not moderate the environment of his subscribers. So first they thought that everything would be open and he should agree to any offensive comments, and his assistants would not moderate his account. But when the situation from their point of view passed the turning point, they just blocked his account entirely, with millions of subscribers, which was cut off from the comments for acting president of the United States. This is something out of Orwell's books. And may I ask my second question? In the social media now, they write about proposals to annul visas and residence permits in the EU for Russian citizens. And if this happens, then the children of the Russian citizens which have no Russian citizenship will be in a difficult situation, and they could be taken away from their parents. Is there a possibility to give such children Russian citizenship quickly if such situation is produced? I would like to say that if the child's parents, when it's born, are Russia's citizens, receives Russia's citizenship automatically by birth. That's one thing. And the necessary formalities for obtaining Russian citizenship and obtaining a passport for a child, for a newborn, well, there are certain exceptions, but can be conducted quickly based on the workload of our relevant agencies and given the COVID restrictions. And if the child is born in a mixed marriage between Russian citizens and foreigners, this can be based on a written agreement on the part of the second parent, and the decision is made by the relevant authority on citizenship issues. And if on the day of such a request the child was under 14 years old, this decision can be made very rapidly. And if we talk about citizenship for a child between the ages of 14 and 18, the decision is made in compliance with the competent Russian authorities in up to 6 months. Thank you very much. And I think we also were supposed to have another media from Yerevan, Aravot newspaper. Do we have you here? Yes. Good afternoon. Naira Bagdasaryan. Madam Zakharova, could you please comment, is it possible to expect a scenario in which the mechanisms of organization of the collective security treaty would be involved in settling the conflicts. I would like to mention that the problem of Ukrainian settlement and the Kiev side and Minsk agreements has been mentioned repeatedly with our allies at various meetings and in our meetings with various security secretaries, defense ministries, etc. If we talk about negotiating this topic, or do you have any more specific question? No. Is it possible that they would be involved specifically? I think CSTO has committed it. I think its chairmanship has committed it, and I am ready to send you links to their declarations. Do we have here any further questions? Yes, Moscow Post. I have two questions, if you permit. My first question, OSCE mission in the report of 21st of February of this year confirmed a violation of international humanitarian law by Ukrainian military men, but during the extraordinary meeting, the Permanent Council called upon Russia to withdraw their armies and condemned the separatist formations and recognitions of such separatist formations. And how do you evaluate this? And we would like to understand what should be done by international institutions to avoid this bloodshed phase. Well, you cannot divide into black and white. Well, in some situations it might be possible, but this is not the case, and OSCE has actively worked on this issue since 2014. Upon the decision of all 57 member states, there was a special monitoring mission was deployed in Ukraine, which worked in Donbass, and there is a acting representative of OSCE, which is member of the contact group fostering that Kiev, Donetsk, and Lugansk would come to an agreement on implementation of Minsk agreement. But we see that it's insufficient. There were various formats, international efforts, and many other measures. But why were those efforts insufficient? Because this organization includes 57 states, and many of them took a very lopsided, unobjective, subjective position. And I cannot even say that it's Kiev's position, because you really have to study it and analyze it, because this is not a position which would reflect the interests of Ukrainian people. Then it could be called the position of Ukraine, Ukrainian position. This was the position, the standpoint articulated by the representatives of the Kievan regime, which behind which we see mainly the United States. And this position was imposed, or maybe it was forced to be shared by a sufficient number of OSCE states so that they could slow down this process, which could have been very different, could have been much more efficient and dynamic, more productive if the organization worked collectively and harmoniously, if there was no lopsided interpretation imposed, if there was no politicization of the process. So what was the grain, the gist of this politically imposed position? It came down to either supporting or inspiring or justifying Kievan regime in its lack of desire to implement Minsk agreement. And monitoring mission year after year came further away from objectivity, unbiasedness, professionalism, etc. And of course, OSCE could have contributed to the conflict settlement in Donbass, but the real interest in inciting Kiev to complying with its obligations was absent, was lacking, and otherwise there would have been changes to Ukrainian constitution in 2015 already, and the border control would have been established by the Ukrainian state, and there would have been more than one election in those regions and under the observation of ODEHR, and all of this isn't something Russia is obliged to do. Those were the objectives for the contact group, and there was Kiev on one side, Donetsk and Lugansk on another. But those objectives and the implementation of those objectives was not achieved by Ukraine over 7 years if we talk about Minsk agreements. And my second question, and the discussion regarding the genocide in Donbass was mentioned by Scholz, and Blinken has contributed to all of this. How could you evaluate it? How could you comment on it? You mean the lack of desire to see the obvious? Maybe. Because, you know, it's not the first time it happens, is it? Did they ever take a different stand on other global issues where they participated? They have destroyed people in Iraq by hundreds of thousands. They didn't even count them. At some point when they were up against the wall, just said, yes, we were proceeding based on unconfirmed data. We didn't even hear any apologies. So this is a mentality of colonial times, somewhere between the Middle Ages and colonialism. Because when there is this imaginary big white man comes to people which for some reason he thinks are worse than him in development, in civilization, in education, in culture, etc. For some reason they think they're equal, and he's not talking to them as to equals. And not even in a way he would talk to children, because they try to raise children to their level and talk grown-up talk, but talk to them as to hopeless people, you know, like beings. He called them beings. It's even hard for me to utter it. I'm not using some complicated terms, but how can you use biological terms regarding people is something I cannot even fathom. So this ideology of privilege implies that many obvious things can be ignored. And this is the same part of the concept of exclusivity. When people think they're excluded from the real world, then they don't even need to pay attention to it. And we see the same thing along in a number of questions when you provide specific facts, because we started with the questions regarding the proof of NATO's declarations on non-expansion of NATO, which were given to the Soviet representatives and to Russian. We show papers which they themselves have published. And it's not a matter of them believing it or not. They pretend not to see it. They just don't see it. And we have videos of their representatives, and we're not talking about the times of deep fakes, when documentaries were documentaries. They just don't want to see it. And the British foreign minister came here with her unforgettable visit. They asked her a question regarding whether she can confirm or rebut the existence of the British files which were leaked to internet about British interventions on the part of the official governments into our internal affairs and providing grants to mass media, political bias, etc. And she doesn't even hear this question. They ask her for the second time, detailize it, and she just doesn't even grant it her attention. So this is a classic approach when you respond, you have to be able to say yes and no, or you can just ignore it and pretend that nothing is happening. But we do know that if they don't see something, it doesn't mean that nothing is happening. And what the German side resorted to, I'm talking about jokes on genocide. On the one hand, God is their witness, and only God can judge them. We can talk about morals and ethics. And I think such statements shouldn't be judged just politically. But we have evaluated it in our way and have provided Berlin with information on the crimes committed by the forces controlled by Kiev against Donbass. We have just provided this to them, and we will continue such work in the future, and all materials that we have communicated to Washington and Berlin in their entirety have been now transmitted to all capitals, to all countries where we have our embassies. They have presented this collection of materials, and we are only starting this work. This is not the end of it. We're only starting out so that everyone would understand what kind of democratic rulers they have in Kiev.
Спасибо вам.
Можно вопрос?
Can I have a question, please? A Kazakhstani outlet. I want to revisit the question of the CSTO. So, what's your personal opinion? Assuming the Luhansk and Donetsk republics accede to the CSTO, can its contingents, its troops be sent there? And could perhaps a CSTO military base, a military compound, be built at the border? Answer. Well, let's not engage in this kind of a pipe dream building thing. My job is to give comments on what is actually happening and not on what might eventually happen at some point. Now, as far as accession to the CSTO is concerned, whether Luhansk and Donetsk would accede to them, it's the matter of their foreign policy. Well, they've gained statehood like 3 days ago, right? Several states have already recognized them. And I would assume, if we look at the variety of interstate associations, I would say that they have a procedure for this. First, they have to be recognized as states. Then, and only then, they, as budding states, will start their interaction, their interface with the world. You see, they're just making their first baby steps, even in terms of its cooperation with Russia. We are just exchanging the diplomatic foundational documents. So it's premature to say how would they articulate their foreign policy. It would be more appropriate if you ask this question them directly. Thank you. There be no more questions. I would call it a day. Question. And what about the second half of the question? Your cooperation with them? Answer. Well, our cooperation with Donetsk and Luhansk is just starting to unfold. If we have an issue on the agenda, we deal with it. We handle it. If the item is not on the agenda, we refrain from it. Thank you